Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. This week we're going to talk about warfare. So this is one of those subjects where you've got two sides. You have some people that are always thinking, oh, it'd be great to eventually do or to include wars in my game, but I don't know how to do it. And then you have some people who say, well, I want to do it, but my players don't want to do it. And you get that kind of part. So what I'm going to do in this video is we're going to talk about how we can incorporate large-scale battles into our games. And I'm going to give you three different ways. One way is going to require very little, in a sense, on the player's part, because you're effectively going to be playing the same game. You're just going to kind of reframe things so they work in a war scenario, if you will. The second way is going to be kind of the middle point, a couple of systems that you can use to kind of have the battles being fought abstract while the player characters do player character things. And then finally, we'll talk about a couple of pretty simple actual war games that we can incorporate into our normal game. This is my preference because my group likes to try different things. And if I say, hey, do you guys want to do a battle with this war game? They'll sit down and we'll do it. But if you don't have a group like that or you don't want to do that, there's lots of ways we can involve this in our world. First, let's talk about why we want to do this. The first reason is that if you're running an open world / sandbox campaign where the player characters can basically do anything, eventually I found players want to move away from the dungeons. It's fun at first to dive into the dungeons and to get the treasure, but after a while, when they start gaining more and more power, they want to do more epic things. And you can go a couple of different ways. If you're playing a really epic level kind of game, and you might just have them fighting demons and effectively do the same thing they've been doing, just with tougher and tougher monsters. But what I found my groups like, and I like, is when the world stays, heroic, where the player characters really stick out, especially at high levels, and there's not lots of tough monsters all of a sudden, but rather they start to gain power in the world. Sure, your high-level fighter can run around fighting just about anybody in town and beating them, but that becomes boring after a while. They want to occupy areas, take over kingdoms, or defend kingdoms. They want to help larger groups of people overcome larger obstacles that can't be fought with one sword, right? These are the kind of stories that we like to tell, and sometimes the best way to tell them is to have some kind of warfare. Now, the other reason is that you could just start right off from the beginning with wars going on and have it be the backdrop. A war backdrop can be really interesting because it gives you lots of hooks. It gives you lots of kind of emotional connection. You have reasons why there might be limits on things. They show up in a town and there's not food being delivered because the pass is cut off. There's all kinds of other things, especially at low levels, where the war in the background can be really interesting. And eventually we might want to get to the point where the player characters either lead small groups or full armies, or even just become part of one. So we're going to look at several solutions in this video, and let's start with the most kind of abstract. Okay, so I'm starting here because this is kind of the answer to the people that say my players don't want to try anything, but we already know. We only play OSE, we only play Pathfinder, we only play 5e. We don't want to learn anything new. Well, you can still do that. And the way we'll do this is we'll take some ideas from wargaming, but we won't take the mechanics. What we want to do is take the idea of something called victory conditions. What this means is when you're playing a war game, and I am no expert, but just my experience, you don't usually just fight till every soldier is eliminated. Basically, there's a victory condition. We take this hill, we eliminate a certain resource they have, we block off these roads, and then that side wins. You can do the same thing. And what you do is you make these victory conditions be the goal of the player characters. So you put the two armies, the goblins and orcs are attacking the dwarven citadel, and the player characters are there. They're going to help defend it. And they have, the goblins and orcs that is, have 5 hill giants on their side. If the hill giants are not eliminated, taken out of the combat, before they get to the walls will come crumbling down. Was that a John Kruger song? And basically, the goblins will take over. The dwarves will lose. So the player characters are sent out not to fight hundreds of goblins, but rather to fight the giants. And that's what you do. You zoom in. Now, here's the thing. It's not just beat 5 giants. It's beat 5 giants within a certain amount of time frame because the giants are going to keep moving forward. Now, there's lots of ways you can do this. You could just set a number, like a difficulty number. You could say, okay, in 10 turns, the giants will be close enough to start hurling boulders at the walls. That's going to be a problem. Or you could say, every turn, the giants do X amount of damage. Again, it's more abstract. And this damage goes against a number that you have preset. So you can have almost like a clock, and your clock is actually represented as hit points. So let's say it's 300 hit points. And every turn the giants are attacking, they just give them automatic hits. And they just roll damage. And that keeps going down. And if they have cumulative damage they do to this hit point clock goes down to 0, they are now at the walls and breaching. So again, you can do it a lot of different ways. It depends on how dynamic you want to make it. And the player characters will need to get to the giants, obviously avoiding smaller combats in between. You could even throw some in between, almost like you think of traps, right? They're like small hordes of goblins they have to fight off before they can get to the giants, right? And then they get there and they defeat the giants. If they defeat all 5 within the time limit, that they have met the victory conditions. The goblins and orcs can't win. They retreat. The dwarves win. You don't have to worry too much about details of how many people, get lost in the battle or any of that. It's just an overall idea. Now, the other thing here is you don't have to make it always a combat. This victory condition doesn't have to be destroy 5 giants. It could be steal the magic item from the tent of the general. It could be, stop this thing or do that thing. And again, it's just something that player characters have to do within a certain amount of time, ticking clock here, while a battle is raging. The battle is effectively the background. Okay, sticking with this same concept where we don't want to learn any new mechanics, we could still actually fight the battle if we want. And the way I would do that is I would just simply use the mechanics from the system you're using and then make everything at a 20 scale or a 1 to 20 scale. That is to say, if you have 200 goblins, then you make them be 10 goblins. And you have 200 dwarves, you make them 10 dwarves, and you just have them fight it out. And every time one goblin or one dwarf is destroyed, 20 are. Now, player characters, because player characters are the heroes, would count as single figures, and every time they took out a single, they would have a victory. Or you could have special hero characters that they fight that are more on their level. Again, it depends on their level. If they're high enough level where they're killing 5 goblins a go, you can't do that. But you could have them single out and fight, let's say, an ogre or a giant. Okay, but if you're playing at a domain level and it matters how many of the dwarves are defeated and if they lost, certain siege weapons or whatever, how much of the wall was destroyed, you need to know this. You want to know it for ongoing battles. You want a kind of a more depth in the world. For this, you could use something like the battle system in Hyperborea. So I've used this in my Hyperborea campaign. Also, if you watch The Dungeon Minister, which you should, they have done some battles using I believe they got from the Rule Cyclopedia, the War Machine from this. They're basically a similar system. That is to say, it's a bunch of math homework for the DM. I joke, but basically you look at the odds. Okay, how many warriors do they have? How many magic weapons do they have? How many high-level characters do they have? And you basically sum up both sides, giving them a rating, and then you roll a single time against that rating, and basically that tells you who wins and loses. And what's nice about this is that kind of system it still allows for the first thing I was talking about, with the player characters doing special actions, and you can modify the numbers based on that. But what it also does is it tells you, okay, you were victorious, but you lost 20% of your forces. They lost, that means they lost 60%. It's not they're all gone. It's not you're all gone. It's not nobody's hurt. It gives you actual numbers. So when I was running my Hyperborea campaign, I had a large battle going on while the player characters were singling out and chasing down the main hero figures. What I said was, the battle is going this long, because in the Hyperborea one, I'm not sure about the Rule Cyclopedia, but in the Hyperborea one, you roll up front to see how long the battle will be. So I knew the battle was X amount of time, and I decided that these losses were based on the amount of time. I think it was actually 4 hours in my case. So I kept track of time, and I think they finished right around the 2-hour mark when they took out the leader of the other side. That stopped the battle, and then effectively both sides only lost half what they would have lost, right? Because only half the battle happened. This is how we can play this out. It gives us some real gritty numbers, and it's also very useful, again, in more of a sandbox, patron level, as some people call it, campaign or domain level, where people want to now move in here and take over this castle. How many of the dwarves survived after that goblin attack? That's important to some campaigns, and in those cases, these are the systems we use. I will put links to both of those and everything else I talk about here in the description below if you are wondering, because people often ask me that. But let's jump into the way I do it. That might not have been the right way to say it. As I mentioned, I used the Hyperborea system in that case, mostly because we're playing online and I didn't feel like it would be fun to play a war game on Roll20. I wasn't technologically advanced enough to do that. But now that I'm playing mostly in person again, I use Chainmail, which I've talked about before. So Chainmail, if you don't know, is a precursor to D&D. It's a medieval war game, if you will, but it also has fantasy elements. So it ties in perfectly to D&D, even has some of the spells, and this is a great way to play out a battle. Now, yes, this requires a bit more of a commitment. Your players are going to have to want to play a war game. And that means on some level, they're going to have to learn a war game. But I can say, and the reason why I point out Chainmail is I've run Chainmail as part of D&D games at conventions with people who have never played before, and they pick it up pretty quickly. It's not super difficult to play these games. There's a lot of dice rolling and a little bit of math, but really you as the referee are going to have to take on the burden here. So if you are willing to learn the system, you can easily show the players how to do it. In the case of Chainmail, you could do it a couple of different ways. Probably, depending on your system, you might want to combine this with the first thing I talked about, which is the player characters have special missions. And you can give them solo figures on the board and they can move around and get to the people they need to fight and do it that way. Because Chainmail does have what's called fantasy combat, which allows hero types to fight singularly, right? So you can definitely do that. The other way to do it is to just have the battle happen with the PCs more like back at the castle being generals, right? Just say, you're not going to be there on the front because you're too valuable to be standing there swinging your sword. You're directing people. And then you just give them each units to run. It's really fun to change it up a little bit. Again, you got to have a group that wants to try it, but I think, and I made a video about this before, I think that a lot of times we as GMs go, well, no, my group really likes this. They're not going to want to do that. Well, okay, if I showed up to my group and said, hey, I'm not going to run D&D anymore. We're just going to play this war game every week. I'm sure they would be like, not so interested in that. But, it's 1 time, 2 times, it's here and there. You will find that most people, I've found anyways, are into trying different things. So hopefully you have a group that's willing to try stuff, because I definitely recommend that. Now, if that's a little bit too much of a burden, and if you want to maybe run more often or whatever, and you want something simpler, I can totally recommend 1 Hour War Games. This is a great book. I will put a link in the description, like I said, but this is designed to be played on small surfaces, so you don't need a big area. It's designed to be played with like blocks of units, so you could play with miniatures, of course, but you can also just cut pieces of paper or index cards to be the units in the groups. The math here is really simple. The only thing this doesn't really have is magic, so you'd have to figure that out if you want to involve magic in the combats, but these are great. And as the title of the book says, they take about 1 hour. So you can play these out really quickly. It's not going to take up your whole session if you don't want it to. You can really kind of have that quick tactical battle with the 1 Hour War Games. So my hope with this video is to answer some of those questions, because people definitely do come to me. They send me messages or they comment and they say, oh, my group won't do that, or I don't know how I would even do that kind of thing. Hopefully this kind of opens up the way. What I would say is, as some advice, if you don't think that your group would be into this kind of stuff, first of all, ask them. But let's just say that they're kind of lukewarm on it. Then I would start with the abstract stuff. Let them feel out what it's like to be part of a large-scale battle and really narrate the results. What's going on around them, the losses, the way the place is destroyed, now the quests that they're going to have to go on to, help open up the exchanges again, the merchant routes, because they got wiped out during the battle. You can really add all kinds of extra, like humanitarian, for lack of a better word, quests to go with this. And that's going to open up your campaign world to so many more things than just, we go into the dungeon, we kill the monster, or we go fight the dragon on the top of the mountain. It really makes the world feel alive and real, in a sense, as real as a world with dragons can be, when you have these large-scale conflicts. I'd love to know if you add this kind of stuff to your games, how you've done it, how you've been successful. If you've got a horror story about how it didn't work, but then you figured it out, or you have a question of how you might have made it work, throw it in the comments. It's not just me answering it. Lots of people down there talking. And speaking of people talking, check out my Discord server. There's a link to that in the description, along with all this other stuff, and a link to my Patreon if you want to support the channel. I'll talk to you soon.